What's up, YouTube? It's Oz again. If you find this information helpful, please subscribe to the channel and like this video to help push out to more people. I'm trying to build a community here, and I'd appreciate your help. So this is going to be the first video in a series where I'm going to discuss different concepts and theories behind how to build a van. You know, I've watched a lot of people build vans, and there have been a lot of times that I've seen people do things in ways that I just scratch my head and think, what are they thinking when they're doing that? And so I want to just kind of put some information out there that might help you in your journey to build a van. As somebody who's built a lot of things in my life, I have some certain amount of knowledge that it seems like a lot of people in the van life community don't have the benefit of having. I see a lot of them that clearly have never built a house and stuff like that, so today I want to talk about insulation, what is the proper way to insulate? Why do we insulate? What is insulation, and what are the theories behind it? And my ideas about, how to really insulate a van correctly, you know what I mean? What I believe to be the correct way, okay? It's not my intention to tell anybody else that they're wrong or whatever, but just go and look into some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about, and don't put van life in the search term, you know what I mean? Just look at how to insulate houses and stuff. So when you think about insulation, one thing that you need to realize is that insulation is only about heat. It's not about cold. It's not about cold weather or cooling or anything like that. The only thing insulation has to do with is heat, okay? The object of insulating a wall is to slow the transfer of heat through a wall, okay? That's all you're trying to do. Now, in vans, you face a little bit different situation than what you would normally face when you're trying to insulate something, okay? Because a van is made of metal and it's sitting in the sun. And so you kind of have to approach it from a different angle than you would if you were insulating a house, okay? The number one thing these days that they talk about when you're insulating a house is sealing everything, because you're trying to control the convection inside. But with a van, it's a very small space, and while you want to have it sealed, that's not really the main concern when you're insulating it. So when you're thinking about insulation, there are three different types of heat, okay? There are three different types of heat that you're fighting against. Conduction, convection, and radiation. You've got conductive heat, you've got convective heat, and you've got radiant heat. Convective heat is the movement of air inside, and it touches on the hot surfaces of the van as it moves around, and it heats the air. Now you're in a very small space, so it's not that difficult to warm and cool the air directly. But the problem is that there is so much conductive and radiant heat that it's hard to deal with unless you insulate. So what we have to mainly deal with, assuming you're going to have a heating source inside the van and a cooling source inside the van, most people don't, but I will, is the radiant heat and the conductive heat, okay? Conductive heat. So when the sun is beating down on the outside of the van, if you go inside the van and you put your hand directly on the metal and it burns the shit out of you, that is conductive heat. That is the sun's rays beating down on the side of the van and heating up the metal, and the metal itself is hot. So when you touch it, it conducts through to your hand. That's conductive heat. Radiant heat is when the sun is beating down on the skin of the van and you go inside the van and you don't touch the metal. You just put your hand kind of close to the metal and you feel the heat just radiating off of that hot metal. That's radiant heat, okay? So, how do we mitigate this? Because the idea is to stop or drastically slow these two types of heat from transferring from the outside hot skin of the van to the inside surfaces of the van. So, conductive heat happens because of something called thermal bridging, okay? The sun is beating down on that piece of metal, and because it's the exact same piece of metal, when you touch it on the inside, it just sends the heat right through and heats the metal up, okay? That's a thermal bridge. Now, if you were to take a piece of whatever, even if it's foam board insulation like you see people use, and you put it directly on that hot piece of metal, that is a thermal bridge. That means that while the foam board insulation will slow the transfer of heat from the metal to the outside of the foam board, it will still transfer. And the truth is, it doesn't really slow it that much because these foam boards have really low R values. But they do help. You know, you want to slow it, and they do help. So, my thought process is to put foam board on the large surfaces that are the actual skin of the van. But you do not want to build that stuff up so thick that it is even to or higher than the ribs on the inside, the framing ribs on the inside of the van. And we'll talk about why. And I also will say that I would say to use the type of foam board insulation that has the foil backer on it. And we'll talk about why in a moment. And I've seen people install this stuff incorrectly 1,000 times. All right, the correct way to install it is you do not put the foil against the metal. You put the foil facing the inside of the van away from the metal, okay? So this is going to slow the heat from coming through, but it also creates a radiant barrier. And so that moves us to radiant heat. So when you use this foam board with the aluminum on one side, you know, people think that, well, that's not doing anything because the radiant barrier is supposed to reflect the heat back away. And if you do this, it's facing the inside of the van. The thing you have to understand about radiant barriers and the aluminum that they use is that, yes, one way that they work is that they reflect the radiation, the radiant heat, back away, and they try not to let it through. They reflect it away. But this material is also not good at radiating heat itself. So as the heat soaks through the skin of the van and through the insulation and comes to the outside, that aluminum is not good at radiating that heat out toward the inside of the van, unlike the metal or any other surface, really. So it does work from either direction, and that's something that is largely misunderstood about the material reflectings that everybody uses, is that it really only requires an air gap on one side because it works either way. It reflects from one side and it doesn't like to radiate from the other side. Okay, so when you do this, you're just kind of creating one little radiant barrier in the worst spots. Okay, so you use this foam-backed insulation board, and it creates somewhat of a radiant barrier. Then, I talked about thermal bridging. So the next thing is to reduce thermal bridging. You don't want things directly touching the outside of the outer skin of the van. Okay. So how do we accomplish this? If you take a sheet of 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, probably better, plywood and cut it into, say, 3-inch slats, okay? And then you put these slats across the whole walls on both sides of the van, say 1.5 feet apart, okay? And you only attach them to the ribs. You never attach them to the outer skin. You only attach them to the ribs on the inside of the van, okay? Then what you're doing is you're creating fewer spots for that thermal bridging to occur, okay? Instead of putting a wall board up there, or slats or whatever you're going to use, and attaching them all over the place into these ribs, you've only got a minimal amount of spots that are touching the ribs on these slats, and then you connect your boards to the slats, and you're reducing the thermal bridging. You have far fewer spots that are solid all the way through to the outside. So this reduces the conductive heat. So now you've mitigated the radiant heat a little bit, and you've reduced the thermal bridging to deal with the conductive heat in large part. Okay, so now you take the reflectix and you put the reflectix over the slats first. First, you cover the whole slat, the whole wall with reflectix. Okay, then you put your little thin paneling or your wall boards or whatever you're going to put and connect those to the slats. All right. So what you've done is with this method is first you have reduced the radiant heat that's coming in with the foam board with the aluminum in the worst spots. Then you've mitigated the conductive heat by minimizing the thermal bridging. Then you've created another radiant barrier so that everything that does make it off of the skin of the fan, the reflectix attempts to bounce it back off, and it's got an air gap because you did not build the foam board all the way up, and you also have this 3/4 inch slat that's going across. So you've created a good size air gap, and you're mitigating a lot of that radiant heat, okay? And then you put your board over the top of that. And another thing that you've accomplished is if you don't cap everything off at the edges, then this air gap allows that wall to breathe. And something that everybody, like you see a lot of van lifers talk about vapor barrier, and they use reflectix as a vapor barrier, or they try to really seal it off really well. I don't recommend that because one of the biggest things that everybody talks about is moisture and mold, and not wanting to get moisture in the walls and create mold and stuff. And the way you do that is with this method that I'm talking about, because it creates an air gap in there, and if you don't close the sides off, it gives that moisture a way to evaporate. And so, in my opinion, this is the best way to insulate a van. You're going to lose a couple of inches. You're going to lose an inch on each side, you know what I mean? But like, this is the way, in my opinion, that you're going to create an environment inside that van that is much more controllable and is going to mitigate the heat the best that you can do inside of a van. And really, it's not that much. What are you into it? A few pieces of foam board, some reflectix, and a sheet of plywood, maybe two. I mean, it's not real cost prohibitive. What's cost prohibitive is going and trying to do spray foam or buy Thinsulate or something. These things are expensive, and they're probably going to trap moisture. So, don't take my word for it. I'm not an expert. Go do some research about, not just people insulating vans. Go do some research about how insulation works, and how, watch videos about insulating houses and stuff like that, and how it's totally different than a van, but the concepts are the same. Go do some research on it to learn about insulation, and then come back and think about the way that I'm saying to do things. Anyway, I hope you learned something. I hope this was helpful. If it was, and you think it's good information, hit that subscribe button. like the video, and thanks for watching.